I'm very pleased to introduce to you Alastair McIntosh and Mhairi Killin. Mhairi is a multidisciplinary artist who works with drawing, print, sculpture, and installation in an exploration of the landscape that surrounds her home on the island of Iona, where she also runs Dana, which is home to a silversmithy and a few other micro-businesses from the island. She was elected to the RSA in 2015, and her most recent work is called On Sonorous Seas, which explores the impact of anthropogenic sound pollution on the modern human world. Alastair McIntosh is a Scottish writer, academic, and activist. He was brought up on the Isle of Lewis and is perhaps best known for his involvement with Scottish land reform, especially on the Isle of Eigg and a successful campaign against the super quarry on the Isle of Harris. He is a fellow of the Centre for Human Ecology, an honorary fellow of the Schumacher Society, and helped to set up the Govan Bay Skelgale Trust, of which he is a treasurer and a non-executive director. In 2006, he was appointed to the honorary position of visiting professor of human ecology at the University of Strathclyde. So, without much further ado now, I'm delighted to finally hand over to Mhairi and Alastair.
Hi, Mhairi. How's the weather over there?
Hi, Alastair. It's actually calm today, which is unusual. I'm sure as you know, and many listeners on the talk will know that island life is dominated by wind generally. And wind shapes our lives, and I think it shapes our minds as well, actually, this invisible moving mass of air and energy.
Wind and the crack, because the first question would be, how's the weather over on your part or your island? And the second question would be, what's fresh?
Yeah.
What's fresh? What's fresh in the social wind? What's going on in the people dynamics, which I suppose is two of the fundamental paradigms of embeddedness that we have in island life.
Yeah, absolutely. That relationship between human, between community and the elements is absolutely key. And I think one of the biggest adjustments that you make when you become part of an island community.
I noticed that this event is being set up by postgraduate students at St Andrews, and I'm sure you, like me, get a lot of students come to you and say, we're wanting to do our PhD or whatever, a thesis on such and such an island. It's so beautiful there. And I find myself saying to them, well, you don't go there to buy or grab a bit of the view. If you're going to approach an island with integrity, you approach sensitively at the level of soul. And they say, well, how do you do that? And I say, what I suggest to them anyway varies. I always say to them, before you turn up with your camera or your recording device or anything like that, offer to be of use, offer to be a volunteer doing what nobody else wants to do, weeding the gardens, rubbing down paint on the boat, something like that, and connect socially. Then you'll start to see the island.
And I think Rutger's presentation really exemplified that observation, Alastair. I think his comment is so beautiful that he said the smiles on people's faces, and that says it all for me, really. It's a level of compassion. I think there's a curiosity to volunteer in the first place for something like the peat dam building project at Cheredigan, a curiosity to be involved, a compassion towards the land and towards its history and towards its future. And I'm going to say the L word, and I know it's early in the conversation, but it's love as well, that embodiment to physically put yourself out there in the elements, and to work as a group and as a team towards a common purpose.
I'm thinking that over there in the southwest of Mull, presumably that's over somewhere near Ered Island. Would that be right, where we've just been looking? Yeah, I remember the first time I used to be business advisor to the Iona community, as you know, in the 1980s, and I'm a long-term associate of the community, quite often running things at the Abbey when they have events on, at least before COVID. And I remember the 1980s, Mhairi, I was over in Iona and I was planting trees around the place. You know those alder trees that are growing in Dunsmerach Garden? The ones along the fence. Some of those are mine. There was a gardener who subsequently came and replaced some of the ones that didn't take, but that kind of stuff. And I went over to Erid, just near where we were talking about. And what really, oh, it's so funny. I was trying to remember his name and it's just popped back into my mind. A guy called Frank from Easterhouse. So there were these folks, I mean, an international group from, to do with the Findhorn community and the Dutch family that own, or at least then owned Erid. I don't know what it is now. And there was this guy, Frank from Easterhouse. And, you know, he was working in the garden, in the organic garden there. And this guy, he just felt his life had been renewed coming out of the city. I'm speaking to you here from Govan in the middle of Glasgow, or in the edge of Glasgow. But he felt going to Iona had it had opened up a whole new world, that nature and people who accepted him with love transformed his life for him. Mm. And you must see a lot of that in the pilgrims coming to Iona, the tourists and the travelers and the pilgrims. You can take it as a gradation. Eh? You must see a lot of that with your studio being just on the way up to the Abbey there.
Mm. We do, without doubt, Alastair, and I experience it myself as well. So I think there is something about the energy of islands. I know that you talk about it a bit in your book, Island Spirituality. I think you actually even say it's the island's greatest export.
Spirituality, our greatest export, yes. Sense
of transformation or change, and Iona in particular, I can't speak about the other islands off the west coast, but Iona in particular is formed, as you know, like from some of the oldest rocks on the planet. So it's too old even for fossils. And I like to think that maybe some of this really, if you imagine the atoms that are contained and the energy that is contained within these rocks, and that this is the ground that we're walking on the island, and that some of that ancient energy is mixed with ours and changes our perception. And you often hear about people on Iona who stay for a few days, even for a few hours actually, they talk about a change in perception of time, a change in perception of space. They feel, although the island is very small, they feel it's expansive.
Yeah.
And I think it's it allows us to lean into some sort of quantum definition of time, and people have it's very experiential, it's embodied. People talk about having very lucid and deep dreams. They talk about having waking reveries, and of course it's a landscape like Lewis, which is steeped in mythos. The place names are, they talk of angelic visions and fairy encounters and gods of the sea, and it's hard. It's hard not to be influenced by that or struck by that. I think when you're on Iona, and even as a permanent resident, I still feel it. And energy, of course, is I know. I watched you give a talk a couple of weeks ago, and you were talking about the fuel poverty in Govan, and you were sitting in the room that you're in at the moment, and you were, I was very impressed because you took out a device to warm yourself up rather than...
I've got it on right now. My electric jacket was 3 different settings. The idea being you charge up I'm evangelical about this, folks. You charge up a USB battery and there's a pocket. So you warm yourself, and it doesn't mean you don't have to warm the house. I mean, the house has to be kept free of mold and so on, but you don't have to warm the house so much.
And I remember visiting you in Govan a few years ago, and you spoke a bit about how you use renewable. You have solar panels, but you live in an area of Glasgow, obviously, where there is a lot of fuel poverty, and even more so with the crisis.
I mean, I don't know if you can see, but you know, there's a factory at the back of our garden there. That's Govan Elder Park Workspace, and a closed down Victorian school behind. So we're in a row of terraced houses here, with the Galgale Trust, which I'm involved with, just down the road, somewhere that's an organisation that takes a lot of inspiration from Iona. In fact, we're going to be up there in 2 weeks' time, bringing a group of 16 up to Iona if we get the minibus sorted out. That's what one of my colleagues, Jahan MacLeod, is working on today. But we're talking, I mean, this is a Centre for Energy Ethics, and we're talking about energy and landscape. So in very practical terms, energy is very expensive on islands. Island houses tend to be old and poorly insulated. On our house here, let me see if I can just pull it out here. By the way, I'm down in the croft here. Here's my chicken. I keep my chicken handy so that when I'm on a Zoom and somebody's child turns up, oops, I can pull the chicken out and have a conversation with it. But what have I got here? Yeah, you see, on our house here, as you see, we've got solar panels on the roof. The solar panels, we realized most of the energy was getting exported to the grid, for which you only get 5 or 6 pence a unit. So we put in an air source heat pump, which only cost £2,000 back in 2013. So that's blowing warm air that comes up the stair here. And then on the outside of the house, we've got that thickness of this polystyrene type insulation cladding that they use, which I actually approve of because it's such a good insulator. And on the inside external walls, we've got this 3 millimeter thick, what's it called, Walrock thermal liner. So keeping warm, you know, it's our first question in energy terms, living in islands, or indeed in, you know, where you're being careful about fuel because of climate change and so on, is how do you keep warm economically? And then that feeds through, as you're saying, into holding together the fabric of the island, holding together the community. We were talking when we were planning this session about the French paleontologist, a scientist of fossils, and also a Jesuit priest, who's Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote in 1936, "Someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides and gravity, we shall harness for good the energies of love. And then for a second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire." That's what you're talking about with the love. And in your own work, I mean, tell us a wee bit about your own recent work with the sonorous seas. I pulled out, Mhairi, just to show folks this card that I purchased recently by an artist called Nicholas Slattery, of an old man, mind you, his beard is less grey than mine is, listening to the sound of the sea and what that evokes. But you've been working with soundscape and whales, dolphins, that kind of stuff, yeah?
No, I've been listening to the sea. I have been listening to the sea, Alastair, but that card actually reminds me of also when I was doing the Resoundings project, when I was looking at sound as defining sacred space on the islands and the absence and the presence of the bell. And it reminds me of the robust conch, when a conch was used, when the bells were no longer in the landscape post-Reformation, a conch would be used in a similar way to call people in from the fields or call people to gather in community. And yes, again, I've been listening to the sea in a way, not through a conch shell this time, but actually through the wonderful shamanistic qualities of a hydrophone, which links our world to the aquatic world, and in particular looking at the soundscape of whales and the soundscape of the military around Mull and Iona and the Outer Hebrides, and the impact and what happens when these two overlapping and very cryptic environments collide. So that's been the focus of my work for the last couple of years. And I wanted to go back also to your, because I think this thing about you describing all these amazing materials that you're able to incorporate in your home and Govan, whilst living on Iona with its rich mythos and wonderful, deeply, storytelling and environment is fabulous for my creative spirit and soul. It's challenging when you want to put things like solar panels on your 18th, 19th century cottage in a conservation village. So we have huge challenges here in terms of how we deal with fuel poverty and how we deal with the fuel crisis. And the way that we've tackled it on Iona is through the formation of a charity, an island-led charity called Iona Renewables. And we've got a progressive plan to install not air source as you've got in Govan, but ground source, ground source heat network, which will be owned by the island and will service the island, and ultimately the profits from it after we've paid off the loans will stay on the island. And that will save about 150 tons of CO2 going into the atmosphere. So yes, story is really important in my work, so the story of Unsonored Seas, it began with a whale which came ashore, a whale carcass which came ashore on the island, and living in this really rich, mythos-drenched landscape is incredibly powerful for an artist, and it's also challenging in practical terms. And that's where, and maybe, I heard you talk a couple of weeks ago and you described community as being like a basket, this taut, woven receptacle and container. And I think that, this challenge of living in a very beautiful and highly protected area, and also the challenge of having to be practical and pragmatic and deal with things like the energy crisis and fuel poverty in a small population. Those are some of the tensions that I would experience as an islander and as a person living within a small community that is trying very hard to be progressive whilst sustaining this deep mythological landscape. And I just wondered if you could talk more about that metaphor of community as
the basket of the community.
Yes.
You said the bread basket. Wait, just hang on a moment. I mean, that's literally a French bread basket. I mean, look at the size of it. You see that? You see the scale of it? That was given to me on the island of Wesson in Brittany by a French bread maker. And these are for the bread to rise in. Some baguette, that would have been, eh? Look at the width of it. So, I mean, in a basket, you've got the warp, the long bits, and the wefts, the sideways bits that weave together. And the image that came to my mind 2 or 3 years ago, well, really came to my mind during COVID, when people were losing connections with each other and really feeling it, and especially poor people, especially people on benefits or with disabilities, illness, stuff like that. It was much easier for the relatively well-to-do, like we've got a car, we're able to get out and go walking in the nearby Kilpatrick Hills and still be within the regulations for exercise and so on. But for people who are trapped, people who didn't have a garden like I've just shown you, their world was becoming unraveled. On one occasion in a local organization I'm involved with we had a gathering in the woods around a fire because we'd had 2 suicides amongst our people. Their lives had unraveled, obviously multiple things going on, but not helped by COVID. And it came to me that in the modern world, especially for people who don't have a lot of choice, I mean, if you ask what poverty does to people, it basically limits choice. And it leaves people limited as to what they think their choices are. You get these compound spirals. It's like, for many people, life is going out at warp speed. You know, Starship Enterprise at warp speed, it's going out. And if it's all warp, if it's all the long strands, they widen out and become very dissipated. And what community does is it weaves the weft, or the woof, as they say in America, backwards and forwards, and it makes a tight basket. It makes a strong fabric. I mean, you're ancestrally connected to Iona, Mhairi, and I think of the story of St. Columba of Iona's Irish mother, Esne, and how before he was born, an angel came to her and said, I forget the exact story, but gave her a vision that, you know, the son she was going to have would minister to the entire world, which Iona does. And the angel showed her a beautiful mantle, a beautiful shawl, blanket, that had the color Adamnan. St. Adamnan of Iona tells us in his biography, there it is, you know, it had the color. He was writing 100 years after the death of St. Columba, had the color of all the flowers of the field, all the flowers of the moor. And Esne reached out to take the mantle, symbolizing her child, but the angel took it back and said, no, you have to let it go. And Esne saw the angel moving further and further back, but as the angel receded, so the mantle expanded until St. Columba's mantle covered the whole world. Now, of course, it's a variation on the story, or I would read it as a variation on the same story of Bridget, Bridget St. Bride, who comes in spring and spreads her mantle, you know, the Cailleach, maiden mother crone, the Cailleach transforms into the maiden again and spreads her mantle, and the flowers grow, the cows graze, the cows, and then the women are filled with milk and new life comes, and so the cycle of life repeats. So that's what I take, and it ties in also. You've been reading Ursula Gwyn, haven't you? Because she talks about the same kind of idea. The female science fiction futuristic writer, Ursula Le Guin. If that's how you pronounce her name, I'm not certain.
Le Guin, I think it is Le Guin, as in Gwyneth. I think it is like the Welsh Gwyn. But I think
Le Guin, is it? Okay, thanks.
She, yes, absolutely. No, and when I heard the talk, when you spoke of community as being like the breadbasket, it reminded me of her essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, and which is basically like a different origin story, and it counters the heroic evolution story of mankind, and she puts forth, following the thoughts of many like female anthropologists, that the most important technological advancement that we made was actually not the creation of weaponry, but was the creation of the receptacle, the carrier. And she actually describes it as before the tool that forces energy outward, we made the tool that brings energy home, because we needed to bring the food home, we needed to sow the seed, we needed something to carry the child in as we sowed the seed. And she then relates that to mythos, she then relates that to storytelling. And that was a story, not the heroic evolution story, but the story of this receptacle as a source of energy that came inwards, towards home, towards community. That's that was a story she could identify with, and she saw the novel also as a receptacle. And she beautifully says at the end of the essay, "Still there are seeds to be gathered and room in the bag of stars." So the bag becomes the holder of these stories, these work stories, these conversations that happen as we work, which is very typical of kind of, you know, island life as well, small community life.
You're making me think of how feminism has been reclaiming words like hag and bag.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
figures like Mhairi Daly with a hagiography and playing the word both ways. Hagiography, of course, meaning the study of saints.
Yeah.
But the way Mhairi Daly used to play it was to pull double meanings out of these. And the expression, you know, oh, she's just an old bag. Turn that around, rework that one, and you get an honored position, an honored role of gathering the community. By the way, I see our hosts have put into the chat saying if anybody's got any questions, could they post them to the Q&A section? And there's not any questions, I don't think, showing yet, so we can carry on a bit. But as soon as a question pops up, perhaps, Anne, if you could interrupt us and get the question fed in, but just to encourage folk listening out there to do that. So if I can just come back on your metaphor from Ursula Le Guin with the bag as being the primal technology, the primal tool, so to speak. And you were mentioning there the role that the conch shell has in gathering people. I got to know you best through your resounding project, where you worked with figures like John Purser in casting bronze bells of the Celtic type that Adamnan and Columba would have known well. And we went up to St. Malua's church in Lewis, one of the pre-Reformation the temples. We went up there and we sounded them out. And that very real sense, Mhairi, of sound being used to gather the community, but destructive sound, the kind of sound that the military make, which of course is concern in its effect on whales and dolphins and other sea life. Destructive sound destroying community. Yeah. I see somebody's got a question in it. Do you want to come back on that, and then maybe Anne will lead the question?
No, I think it's a complex relationship, the military to the Hebrides, and I think it. I think some of it is more visible than others. The presence of the military, obviously, it's very visible in the 12 sites that scatter from all the way up to St Kilda. But the less visible presence of the military is definitely what happens underneath this apparent pristine beauty of the Hebridean seas. And one of the scientists who worked on the project described what lies below that surface as an industrial landscape. And we don't see that. And I think that part of the project for me was part of an important aspect of the project was to bring that story to the surface, to make this more visible. And I think that also within our visual vocabulary, the military sites throughout, I mean, I was brought up in the Clyde with, Polaris and the biggest nuclear base in Europe across the water from me. So we've become, our visual language accepts these military installations in Scotland very readily. And maybe we don't question their presence as much as we should. And the story of the whale coming ashore in Iona links us way back to our Neolithic islanders, for whom a whale would have been coming ashore was a great source of excitement, and it still is in present times, and sadness as well.
I'm thinking of Thorley MacLean's biographical. Where is it? Thorley MacLean. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
You can still hear me. I'm just thinking if I can find the video here from Halleck.
Yes.
No, I can't lay my hands on it right now. But Saul McLean, the Sky poet, made this incredible. Tim Neat made this incredible film called Halig. By the way, there's the Calliach that one of my former students made. It's a storytelling Calliach, complete with a bit of seaweed and a shell. But do check out the film Halig, Hallaig, because that uses imagery of whales and whale carcasses that the artist Will McLean, the Dundee artist, put together and ties it in with this Isle of Rassay poetry from Sorley about the clearances, contrasting military power with the power that cleared people from the land, raising very deep questions about what it means to be human. Very deep. Anne, do we have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Alastair. I'm going to jump in with the first audience member
Tony,
question.
hi. Yeah.
And thank you to you both for a conversation that's been brilliant so far. So Ewan asks, when it comes to the interconnector, hopefully being set up this decade to increase the energy capacity on the Outer Hebrides, how can we ensure that renewable energy development can provide both revenue for community landowners and energy justice for residents? And there's a second question, can we trust the approach of developers which approach community ownership through shares/stocks or insist on a different approach? And this is for both of you, Barry and Alastair.
I'd like to just respond to that with an example of what's happening in Scotland at the moment, which folk may be aware of or not. I've got it in my notes here. It's an SSEN green development proposed for the Highlands, centred around Beauly, ironically named by Mary Queen of Scots for its beauty, which this proposed development will undoubtedly destroy. And a substation 35 times the size of a football pitch and a transformer unit 12 times the size of a football pitch is being proposed for the Scottish Highlands, along with a reservoir as well and various other infrastructure. And this is not clearly a grass-led community renewables project. This is a corporate renewables project. It's a green industrialisation of the Scottish Highlands, and none of the energy generated will stay in Scotland. None of the income from the energy generated will stay in Scotland. It will be taken across land by huge transformers to the coast, and then via a subsea cable will get channeled south. And that's it. This is not renewables. This is corporate greed under the banner of renewables. Scotland doesn't need that energy. We don't need any more energy actually for consumption. And the value of this energy, it will not stay in Scotland or benefit the communities that it is destroying, and it will displace people in the same way that corporations, logging in the Amazon displaces Indigenous people. So Indigenous people will be displaced from their land to allow this to happen. And then the domino tumbles, and the minerals that are required to make this to build this infrastructure, they have to be extracted as well. So they'll be extracted from where other communities will be cleared from the land in places like South America, Central Africa, China. And, this is not on a par with a grassroots-led community renewables project such as happening on Iona, which only creates enough electricity, which only creates enough energy as is needed. It's balanced, it's an equation. This is extraction on a massive, massive scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm very concerned about the proposed interconnector to the Isle of Lewis. I'm all in favour of something of a capacity that would allow communities to benefit from their renewable energies. So, for example, both the Point and Sandwick Development Trust and the Golson Land Trust in the Isle of Lewis are both producing about £1 million a year that they distribute much of that back to the community. In Golson, they've just issued every household in Golson, that's the northern part of Lewis, with, I think it's a £60 voucher that can only be spent in local shops. And this is profits from their, is it 3 wind turbines I think they've got? It's profits from their wind turbines, putting money directly back and using it to support local businesses. That's the kind of thing that can happen at a community level. The worry is the corporate level, and my worry about a big interconnector is it will allow these colossal wind farms. I see the latest ones being proposed for the Isle of Skye, where they're going to be repowering, i.e. building much bigger turbines than the ones before, on a site that's already at a substantial elevation. It is going to mean that the tips of the turbines are going to reach up 2/3 of the height of the Killin mountains. Now, you know, folks, we need to ask, what are these places for? Are these places for the production of energy? Are they to be industrial platforms, basically? Industrial offshore platforms to produce energy? Or should the renewable energies be kept well out to sea and piped in from there? And these places be treasured for their beauty, for their community, for their people showing ways of living more simply, if not entirely from the land, with the land. And it ties into Ewan's second question about developers approaching community ownership through stocks and shares. I would imagine, you know, I have right here on my desk, because I'm writing on this just now for Community Land Scotland, the current issue just came out this week of Reforesting Scotland magazine. If you Google it, you can actually get the main articles, one by Jeremy Leggett and the one I'm studying and extensively pencil marking just now by Theo Stanley, who is a doctoral researcher at the Oxford University Centre for the Environment, who's been looking at the claims about the carbon market. And my goodness, I was at this seminar in Strathclyde University that Phil Hannon put on 2 weeks ago. This whole carbon market thing is sweeping in on us at a rate we don't understand. The World Bank alone documents 68 different carbon credit schemes. I was studying the small print of the UK's Woodland and Peatland Code the other day. And what it involves, let me put it like this, basically a developer can buy up land, you know, whether they claim green credentials like Jeremy Leggett with Highlands Rewilding does, or simply hardcore commercial credentials. They can buy up land in Scotland because there's no control over that. And they can say, we're going to rewild it, or we're going to replant it, whatever they say they're going to do. And straight away they can apply to get carbon credits before the trees are even more than saplings, based upon what is called a PIU, a pending insurance unit, which is basically a futures market in carbon. So, Mhairi, I can sell to you one of my PIUs for carbon offsetting, which will allow your silversmithing workshop to emit carbon dioxide by burning fossil fuels, even before my trees have started growing, because it's a promise to make sure they do grow. And then that promise is binding, or meant to be binding, on future generations. So in doing that, the land I've come in and bought up, I would say colonized, is going to be tied up for future generations. And the worst part of it is that plantation is also allowed. And I was reading a forestry study, a major forestry study yesterday, that the most efficient form of carbon capture is Sitka spruce managed plantation. Over 3 times more efficient than deciduous forest or natural regeneration. So if I'm going to be hard-nosed about it, Mhairi, I'm going to plant Sitka and flog you those carbon credits. So I am deeply worried about what is emerging just now, and the way that international capital is eyeing up Scotland as a safe harbour because we're relatively politically stable, notwithstanding the news this morning. we're relatively politically stable, and we are relatively safe from climate change for the time being. They're very worried about it, and people don't understand.
No, and I think it is. I think that's one of the challenges of modernity, that it is so complex, and these issues are complex, and people's lives are complex. And in terms of personal resource and energy, there isn't always a way into understanding what to get beyond the greenwash and find out actually what is behind it. And I suppose I'd like to pose a question to you, Alastair, with your track record, you know, on the transformation on egg, of the community buyout of the Isle of Egg, and also then the super quarry in Harris. At this point, you know, you're the concern that you've expressed here. What do we do? How do we challenge this?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is an academic seminar right here, as you would expect, at arm's reach. I have a printout, The Consequences of Modernity by Anthony Giddens, Tony Blair's sociologist, as was. But this is actually very good. You can get this chapter online, because he's talking about what advanced modernity does is it disembeds community from its context in space and time. And as you were saying to me the other day, or somebody was saying to me the other day, the trouble is that we are as much part of the problem because we're all complicit in it. You know, we are also jetting off on our holidays or buying stuff from China or what have you. But specifically there on your question, what can we do about it? I wonder, I see a second question that's come in. It doesn't say who from, I don't think, because it vibes in with what you just said, Mhairi. Thank you for this engaging conversation. I'm thinking about how artists can better affect national policy to excite and activate new and different audiences in the questions that are being raised today. And all I can say on that front is that with the Harris super quarry dynamic and with the egg land buyout, which I wrote about in my book Soil and Soul, one of the things I draw out there is the central role that artists played in raising consciousness. Things like on Mount Renewables, an artist, I don't know who it was, carving a stone was just the words R.I.P., Renewables R.I.P. In other words, signifying the death of a mountain if building the biggest roadstone quarry in the world to export rock all over Europe to support overdevelopment elsewhere went ahead. The role that the fashion movement has played, the traditional music, poetry, song, that kind of stuff, in connecting us back in with our culture. In the Gal Gael Trust here in Glasgow, the Gal, the stranger, the Gael, the heartland people, there is something of the stranger, something of the heartland people in all of us. And we now have to learn to become again indigenous to our place. What we saw at the beginning here was woodland being regenerated. And I would only say, you know, whenever you engage with such projects, I was pleased to see the Gaelic place name meanings and so on being brought in. Connect that in with the local people, the local culture, the people who have got a vertical connection here through time and not just geographically through space, as John Lone Campbell puts it.
No, absolutely, but I think it's very interesting. And Rutger and his partner Meek, who are at the heart of Cheredigan Trust, are artists. And you know, I'm also a member of the trust, and I'm also an artist. And I think that maybe there is the trickster in the artistic personality, in that we can navigate channels through some difficult issues and reach people in a way that is harder for policymakers and politicians. And maybe there is a less mistrust or more openness towards the artistic and creative spirit, and that the artistic inquiring mind, the curiosity, the compassion, the development into love of place, which Meek and Rutger really exemplifying what they're doing at McFolligan Studies, and also on their, in their role on Cheredigan Trust, that we can do that as very dominant right brain thinkers.
I think you can also do it by receptivity, that art is a receptive process.
Yeah.
The mythos is, I mean, what is mythos? Mythos is kind of the visionary dream world. It is the poetic ground of being, in Kenneth White's terms of geopoetics. Mythos is what holds the poetic world field, if I can put it like that. Whereas logos, rationality, is a much more thrusting, out there, in your face kind of thing. I was actually born in Doncaster, as you know, Mhairi, of an English mother and a Scottish father, and my father was a doctor who had got his first job, graduated from Edinburgh University after the Second World War, got his first job in Doncaster, where my mother was a nursing sister. And when we were 4 years old in 1960, we moved to the Isle of Lewis, where we had some distant family connections, but I grew up in a crafting community like that. And one of the interesting things about it is that I was able to see at firsthand the difference between the Indigenous approach and my mother and her English connections, their type of approach. And my mother used to say, in this world, if you don't push, you don't get anywhere. And I remember the child often being embarrassed at my mother's pushing. In local context, she could get away with it because she was the doctor's wife, but it didn't feel right to the part of me that was immersed in the Indigenous. And it wasn't until my father died and she lost that shield of the professional persona that she then connected in far more with local people, to be astonished that they taught her, they told her about the clearances, they taught her about the significance of social class and so on. She became receptive in a wonderful degree in the latter years of her life. In a sense, she started to indigenize. And I find myself often saying to people, you know, if you go to the, I mean, one guy said to me in Lewis, he says, so Alastair, you know, how long does it take until I belong here? 2 years, 3 years? And I said, maybe 2 decades, 3 decades. And he got impatient and he said, I've not got that long to wait. And I said, then you're never going to belong here. Now, the thing is that had his attitude been different, or were he to acquire a different attitude through, if he was able to hear what I said, you know, some people arrive and they belong in 2 or 3 months because they have that receptiveness to people and they have that generosity, they have that willingness to give and not just take. So these are the transformations. You started off talking about metamorphic rock, Mhairi. Metamorphic rock changed by profound heat and pressure since ancient times. We also have metaphoric people. We also have what it means to be a people, to be a culture of invitation. In Hebridean cultures, at least as I have known them, they are cultures of invitation. People aren't comfortable when somebody pushes their way onto the committee. You wait until the community invites you onto the committee. How does that come? It comes step by step because you've shown yourself to be of service elsewhere. Then you get drawn in, and then, you know, like we see on Egg, it's, you know, incomers like Maggie Fife from the north of England or Camille Dressler from France become pillars of the community because they've understood that. They've served the community, and now they are the warp and weft of the community.
It reminds me, sorry, just briefly, because I know we're coming to the end, but it reminds me of the true, you know, or one of the definitions of conservation, to conserve, to serve, actually, to serve.
Indeed.
You know, which I read recently, you know. And,
indeed. And it's not just natural ecology. I mean, I sometimes feel embarrassed when I see somebody on Twitter or something like that, and it's kind of, oh, you know, we've moved to the Highlands and it's all beautiful sunsets and the aurora and all the rest of it. And I'm kind of thinking, well, no, you've arrived when we see beautiful people, when we see the life of the community coming through, and not in a forced way of a tourist going in with a camera, but in a way that emerges from the camera, from the community. So it's about both the natural ecology and the human ecology. What is ecology? Ecology is a study of plant and animal communities. Human ecology is a study of human community and how that sits with the wider living world and, you know, the whole community. What comes from the bedrock, what the bedrock gifts to us. It all comes